today's episode of Virtual Sentiments, I talked to Lida Maxwell, political theorist and a professor of political science and women's, gender, and sexuality studies at Boston University. Lida's work brings a critical perspective to the typical stories that we tell about truth-telling, whistleblowing, and political heroes. Often the kind of person we exalt as a trustworthy social critic or gadfly has to be seen as objective, self-sacrificing, doing everything, sacrificing their private life out of a kind of public duty with no personal investment in their own actions. But at the heart of these typical social expectations is a deeper political question. What aspects of our lives do we deem as appropriately public versus what we need to keep private? This season, we've talked about surveillance and privacy, and in this conversation, Lida helps us complicate the dichotomy of public and private. Our conversation looks at how the notion of private is often wielded to shut or silence the parts of ourselves that most need to be heard by each other. Much of our conversation draws on Lida's 2019 book, Insurgent Truth: Chelsea Manning and the Politics of Outsider Truth-Telling. But we happened to record our conversation on Earth Day, which was a fitting time for discussing her upcoming book in environmental theory and queer theory, Rachel Carson and the Power of Queer Love, coming out next winter with Stanford University Press. I always love learning from Lida, and I hope that you enjoy listening to our conversation. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Kristen. It's a pleasure.
I am so excited to talk with you for numerous reasons. We recently just talked to tech journalist Samantha Cole, and something that was like a common theme in her book and in our conversation was the way that the internet allows, even from its early days, experimentation and exploration of all sorts of human connection and intimacy, including sexuality, and especially the role that anonymity online plays in that. And so that immediately brought to mind a lot of your work, particularly your book, Insurgent Truth, on Chelsea Manning, and also kind of the way that we might upend the traditional distinctions that we make between privacy and publicity and explore the ways that different individuals have kind of challenged the typical norms we have around what should be public, what should be private. And another kind of theme of the podcast has also been talking with my colleague Chris Coyne about American militarism and state surveillance. And so Chelsea Manning is such a fascinating and incredible figure for talking about these kind of different sides of politics, the way that we upend private and public distinctions, and also the way that we explore complicity and responsibility having to do with kind of American militarism. So yeah, I just wanted to kind of set the framing of sort of what I had in mind and ask you if you wouldn't mind kind of bringing us into your world of how you've worked on these topics and how did you get interested in writing a work on Chelsea Manning?
Yeah, that all sounds like really interesting conversations you've been having. So I started working on Chelsea Manning before, I don't remember the year now. It was soon after she was arrested. And I just found the case really interesting and troubling because at the time, if my memory is correct, there were rumors about her gender nonconformity, but none of that was confirmed yet. It wasn't confirmed until after the verdict against her in the trial. So I was kind of puzzled by how her defenders, and she had some very vocal defenders on the left, how they didn't want to talk about her gender. They wanted to defend her purely in these kind of whistleblower terms, like she's like Daniel Ellsberg, who was the person who leaked the Pentagon Papers famously. She's in this line of whistleblowers who valued public over private. etc. And I honestly didn't understand why it was that they were shying away from talking about her queerness and her gender nonconformity, which were at that point like known, but seemed to be treated almost like as a dirty secret or something that shouldn't be brought into the discussion of her truth telling. And just to remind people who are listening, Chelsea Manning leaked, I mean, a ton of data from State Department cables to data about military actions in Iraq and Afghanistan, famously leaked a video to Julian Assange, to WikiLeaks, that Assange later released as Collateral Murder. That was the title. And what the video showed was very disturbing. It showed US military shooting at civilians. And you see the video and you also hear the audio of them talking and laughing, you know what I mean, while they're shooting. And they purport to think that these people are dangerous. But, you know, when you watch the video, it doesn't seem like it. It doesn't seem like they really think they're dangerous. It seems like they're just kind of shooting, you know, just kind of on a quest to rid the area of people. And there's the people who were killed turn out to be Reuters photographers and reporters. And so that's part of why the case was so famous and why Manning's leaks got so much attention initially. And that video is available to watch. Just obviously be prepared. You're seeing people being shot and killed. But so anyway, Manning leaked all of that data, and her defenders, once she was arrested for leaking this data, defended her on these grounds of, like, you know, she was doing this on behalf of the public good. She wants the public to see what is really going on in Afghanistan and Iraq, the abuses that the military is performing, but no one would talk about her gender or sexuality. And so I started just reading more about it because I was interested. And as I started reading more, what I found was that chat logs between Chelsea Manning and this guy, Adrian Lamo, who was some kind of famous hacker. Honestly, I don't exactly remember why now. Something about hacking into the New York Times. But Manning reached out to Lamo at some point to talk, I think seeking some kind of guidance. And Lamo and Manning chatted a lot, and Lamo kept the logs of their chats. And ultimately, this is how Manning was arrested, turned them into the FBI. But Lamo also released them to Wired magazine. And so Wired initially published them with many parts redacted. And the parts that were redacted had to do with Manning's personal life, and in particular with her gender and sexuality. And then later, when people were like, what are you hiding? They published the full logs. So Wired, I think, like Manning's defenders, thought that putting her gender and sexuality into the picture was doing some kind of disservice, like taking away from, a picture of what she was trying to do, which was about the public good. But when you read the chat logs, what became apparent to me and what kind of started me on this project was that Manning herself saw her gender and sexuality, and especially her experiences with it in the military, as very connected to the mass leaking of data that she did. And so what I saw from the beginning, and what kind of got me into the project, when this was nothing I'd worked on before. I mean, I'd worked on gender and sexuality, but not the military or surveillance. What got me into it was the sense that there's something important about paying attention to how she frames the links between her leaking of data and her gender and sexuality. And so that's what got me into the project.
Yeah, no, that's excellent. And I think, and so, you know, reviewing your writing on this and your analysis of how she framed her kind of approach and saw the connections between her experience with the military and wanting to provide information, act in this whistleblower role. And what was really striking was the pushback, the discomfort she had and rejection she had of don't ask, don't tell, and the idea of techniques of secrecy. You talk about this, of sort of the way that secrecy is used, then kind of creating the, restricting framing of how we think we should think about publicity and public norms. And that she, saw herself as somebody wanting to upend those things, wanting to challenge. She didn't necessarily want to keep her sexuality and gender identity a secret, but she institutionally is forced into that.
Yes. I mean, so yeah, Manning was in the Army, enlisted in the Army, I think because she was looking, she was looking for a place, for a role that would, I think, make her life feel meaningful. And so she tried the army on the suggestion, if I remember correctly, of her father. And in the army, she was already out as queer before going into the army, and then she had to closet herself in the army because it was still don't ask, don't tell. I.e., we won't ask you about your sexuality, but if you tell us, sorry, you're out. And she felt pretty oppressed by that. I think she wasn't super secret about it in the sense that, again, the details are a little bit faded now for me, but I think she kept like a fairy wand or something like that on her desk in the army. She wasn't particularly secret about it, but she also could not really show herself in a way that felt authentic. And so she's having that experience of feeling like the army is requiring her to keep these aspects of herself secret. Well, at the same time, supposedly on behalf of some security, purpose, at the same time that she's seeing how the army is keeping secrets from the American people. And so I think, she doesn't say it in the way that I'm saying it, but in the way she discusses it in the chat logs, to me, I see her tying together these different kinds of secrecy as equally damaging and linked forms of like keeping us from being ourselves and being able to govern ourselves.
No, that's excellent. And so what I also wanted to kind of do a couple contrasts here to kind of get this vision of Chelsea Manning and set up your notion of this of insurgent truth and outsider truth telling. And so, just in the spirit of the podcast, I'm always trying to bring us back historically. I just really love that the way that you frame the book is this contrast between the figure of Socrates, the sort of ideal typical gadfly, and how this is, he is such a figure throughout Western thought and, today in classrooms, and then compared to Cassandra. And this, which then I think you can set up this kind of distinction between these two figures in the way that we talk about the sort of traditional whistleblower frame, Daniel Ellsberg, for example, versus the outsider truth teller, Chelsea Manning, Virginia Woolf, Bayard Rustin, other figures that you discuss. So for those who might not be familiar with Socrates or Cassandra, or just need some brushing up from Theory 101, if you wouldn't mind kind of like helping us see that contrast.
Yeah. So Socrates, yes, is the typical truth teller philosopher that we tend to focus on in political theory and certainly in philosophy. He is living in Athens and doing his philosophy, going around and asking people uncomfortable questions. He is the gadfly. He is ultimately put on trial, right? Convicted for impiety and corrupting youth and sentenced to death, right? So it's like a big deal. His practice of truth telling is held up as kind of necessary to a polity that wants, we just want to be seeking wealth and comfort. And his truth telling helps to bring us, or bring Athens at the time, more toward seeking the good, toward a virtuous way of living, etc. However, people always see this as like some kind of incommensurability between truth and politics, or philosophy and politics. But still, he is seen as kind of like a forerunner of people like Thoreau, like Gandhi, like Martin Luther King, some of whom claim him as such, right? So there's this lineage of like, this is what a truth teller looks like, is like, this guy standing up on behalf of truth against a society that, just wants to seek wealth and comfort. I think that Martin Luther King, standing up against like the white moderate in Letter from Birmingham jail is like a similar framing. And he claims Socrates is an antecedent. And so I think that we have a framing of like, what does a real truth teller look like? Like, when can we as a polity, as a public, see someone who's saying something unpopular, right? Like saying something that might go against common sense, and still identify him as like, wait, this person might have something to say, right? Like they might be saying something important. And I think the Socratic lineage has given us a way of recognizing like, wait, this person might be a whistleblower, and somebody like, they might not be crazy, right? They might not be, they might actually know what they're talking about. And what they do, like Socrates, sacrifice himself on behalf of the public good, right? It's all about like sacrificing himself for truth, that the polity needs to hear. Then somebody like Daniel Ellsberg fits this mold. For people who don't remember, or those of us who weren't born yet, when it happened, barely for me. Ellsberg, I don't remember the year now. Gosh, I wish I did. 70, 60, anyway, somewhere in there, 69, I don't know. Daniel Ellsberg worked for the Rand Corporation and the State Department and had access to the Pentagon Papers, which is just, what he later called the Pentagon Papers, but all these papers about the war in Vietnam that showed that the government had been misleading the public. And he leaked those, all the papers, which were later published, led to kind of like public outcry against the war. And Ellsberg was definitely persecuted by some people at the time, but was broadly held up as a whistleblower, as someone, I'm not doing this on behalf of myself. I'm doing it on behalf of the public because this is the truth and the truth needs to be heard. So my kind of argument is like that this Socratic lineage, gives us a model of like people who are able to say, this isn't about me, it's about the public. And they're people who are already seen, MLK, I'm going to he doesn't totally fit into this mold, but people who already have attributes that make them seem like proper public speakers. So in our society, like a white cisgender man, a heterosexual man like Daniel Ellsberg, looks like somebody, with an elite pedigree in terms of education and work, looks like somebody who might actually be telling the truth. And somebody like Edward Snowden later is often cast in this mold. But people who don't fit that mold, who don't already look like a proper public truth teller, have a lot harder time being heard. And they're seen as bringing their private life into public, even when they're just kind of existing. So like Ellsberg, for example, he talked about his wife all the time, right? Like it's all over the place, but people don't see him as bringing that into public because his sexuality is already normal. Okay, going back to Cassandra. So what I did was look for another kind of lineage and looked at the figure of Cassandra, who, unlike Socrates, he's understood. Socrates is seen by the Athenian public as somebody who has something to say, right? That's part of why he's threatening in the way he is. And he has an elite pedigree. He has lots of elites kind of following him around in his entourage. And people understand what he's saying, even if they don't like it particularly. Cassandra is different. She is a figure who shows up in Greek drama. And what the truth was that Cassandra was trying to tell the Trojans, because she's from Troy, is that they were going to lose, right? They were going to lose. The war was going to make them lose. And it was like nobody could even understand the words she's saying, right? It's like she's like portrayed as this crazy person, right? As like totally unintelligible and very linked to her femininity. And so what I'm interested about Cassandra is that she was telling the truth, right? She knew what was going to happen. She's a truth teller, but she was seen as like completely unintelligible, even as she has something to say that the polity needs to hear. So it's this person who, by virtue of like who they are, just can't even be seen as a proper truth teller. And so like, I think that's a really helpful thing for us to think about in political theory. And I got, that's really the only part of the book that a lot of people, like a lot of friends of mine who read it, pushed back on. They were like, don't you want to give Socrates more of a shot? And I was like, haven't we given Socrates like so much airspace? Like we've given him so much.
Won't somebody think of poor Socrates?
Yes. And I like Socrates as much as the next political theorist. Like I teach him. But there's something important about also paying attention to forms of truth telling that aren't always already intelligible in our current social system. And I think that's what Cassandra points us toward.
Yeah, no, and I love that. And something that you talk about specifically when you're bringing up the example of Cassandra is that she in what you draw on, I guess she refuses Apollo. And so in refusing male and divine desires, term that you use, she is vulnerable to violence, vulnerable to war. And it's that vulnerability and that refusal that makes her be able to access truth in a way that, and it's a very different experience. It's imposed on her rather than through Socrates' choice of living as a philosopher. And so, I love that. And I think it's very powerful. And it's a theme that you draw throughout your work. And why I think it's worth talking about this sort of, okay, we often speak in like a public versus private distinction, but in many ways, we see people who have incredible impact on the world, who have visions of how to live in a different world. And it comes from the willingness to kind of subvert or transcend that dichotomy and then the vulnerability. So just to, I want to hear your thoughts, but I just, because this, I was actually instead of reviewing the ancient Greek, I had my nose stuck in my Audre Lorde Sister Outsider, and I was reviewing the essay that you cite and the concept of tyrannies of silence. And there, and you talk about how she writes about Black women's visibility there and vulnerability, and how it's, realizing when she had this experience with having to get a surgery for breast cancer. The tumor ends up benign, but she had to go through that, and that brush with death, realizing that death is the great silence. That's when we can't speak anymore. And so what she came to regret and what she wanted was realizing all these moments she was silent and the importance of speaking, and that sort of the visibility is what renders people vulnerable to oppression always, but that'll happen whether or not you speak and connect with others. And so it's only in using that visibility that then one can kind of make oneself known and also be again, that connection with others is what's so crucial. And it's going to have vulnerability no matter what. But kind of getting back to sort of what I'm interested in the podcast and sort of thinking about our sort of anonymity and things like that is like, what are the practices that we do that make it easier for people to connect, despite vulnerability and despite, and I think that's sort of what's going on with Cassandra. This sort of vulnerability is this strength, but it's of course that's a difficult thing to grapple with. Socrates, I guess we try to kind of create that sense of vulnerability. I mean, he's executed, but it's just not the same basis of his very articulation of his thought, at least I see it very differently.
And he's willing to die in that way, right? I mean, he takes it on ultimately to sacrifice himself, right, for the truth that he's telling. I think that's one of Arendt's examples of somebody who is able to kind of solidify the meaning of their own story, right, by dying in that act. But thank you for reminding me of what I said about Cassandra, because yes, that is absolutely right. That vulnerability that she at the same time, right, like she refuses Apollo, right? She refuses. And so she's taking, like she is acting, she has agency, right? She removes herself from that economy of male desire and wants to be her own, right? The author of her own voice and her own story. And being in that position allows her to see, as you said, to see that violence, right? And to see, in a sense, patriarchy. I mean, they wouldn't have called it that at the time, but patriarchy in a way that others around her could not, especially the men around her. And so she's able to see it. And that's a theme in the book, right? I mean, that's certainly Chelsea Manning's experience. That's the experience of these various outsider truth tellers that I talk about, is that being kind of like situated, outside, like being rendered vulnerable to the violence of our society, of our social systems, renders you more able to see it. But you kind of become a truth teller, right? When you're able to do what you just said, right? To see that no matter what you do, you're going to be vulnerable to these violences, right? Like the world is not going to be friendly to Chelsea Manning, has not been, right? The question is, are you going to like say your truth, right? Say the truth of what you see, as Audre Lorde says, or are you going to stay silent and try to just kind of like live, as subliminally as you can?
That's great. And bringing it back to that alternative framing of the whistleblower, and what we're talking about is this idea. So concept of outsider truth telling allows us to kind of take a step back further and ask ourselves, who is rendered able to appear to the public as somebody who's a trustworthy truth teller, and then also what is then the framing? What is the way that we think about politics? So typically, and you put this in the book, whistleblowing, someone like Edward Snowden, other figures, and also the way that the media covered Chelsea Manning to begin with was this idea of truth telling as a way to restabilize and check kind of abnormal government corruption, rather than the idea of a truth that is told that disrupts, that challenges and shatters kind of the normal way of thinking about politics. And it's not just destructive; it's also creative. It's the possibility of imagining an alternative system or alternative ways of connecting and organizing ourselves. And specifically when it comes to something like warfare, alternative modes of governance and kind of dismantling a militaristic system.
Yeah. And I think Chelsea Manning, like to go back to your point about Audre Lorde is saying, right, that part of the way that we become able to tell the truth is that we're able to talk to other outsiders who affirm us, right? Who affirm that we actually know the truth, because our society is telling us that we don't, right? And so many of us who are queer, so many people of color, so many, you know, all the marginalized people, all of us in different ways, and women as well, are told that we don't know what we're talking about. And so it's challenging to find our own voice and to find confidence in our own voice. I've certainly had that experience in my life. And what Lord says is when you find other people who have had similar experiences, you can affirm each other. And in affirming each other, you start to realize, no, I do know the truth. My society might be gaslighting me and telling me I'm crazy, but I actually know the truth. And that's part of the building of a space that I think is neither public nor private exactly, but kind of upends that distinction, like the building of a space where you start to be able to like find grounding to tell the truth from. And I think just to go back to the public private point, because that's something that's very important to me in all my work, I think that in political theory and certainly in politics, we really, we think a lot about what's good or bad political action, what's right or wrong in terms of that distinction. Like, are we doing this for the public or am I doing it for my own benefit? And often, like with Manning, a lot of pieces written on her frame her as doing it on her own behalf because she was like resentful about the gender and sexuality policing. And I'm like, how is that on her own behalf, right? Like that's a wrong. Like that's a wrong we should all be concerned about. And so I think that the public-private framing is something we actually, that things like the don't ask, don't tell policy actually holds in place about like what's properly private and what's properly public. And when you're trying to tell the truth from a position of non-gender conformity or from being a woman or from being queer, a person of color, trying to tell the truth from that position, you're always seen as improperly public, like almost always, just because of your identity attributes. And so I think that learning that you are actually telling the truth and that you are a proper speaker of truth, that you can tell the truth, allows you to start figuring out like that like I said before, there's a grounding here of community from which I can speak my truth. But when you speak your truth, and this is what happened with Chelsea Manning, you're challenging that public and private distinction because people see you as bringing something in you're not supposed to. And what Manning did, I think, and what other outsider truth tellers do is actually try to transform that distinction, that public and private distinction. And so rather than seeing her as like improper or like doing this for herself or something, like a lot of people framed her, I see her as trying to transform how we understand what's properly public at all, and showing herself at the time as gender nonconforming, now as trans, to be a proper speaker of truth.
Yeah, no. And I think that makes a lot of sense. And it really does show how, the very notion that we can make a clean separation or clean break from the public and from politics is itself assumes certain ascriptive qualities that are dominant or normalized in ways that is is simply then like exactly if you, as you put it much more succinctly than I have, but just the idea of there's so many aspects of ourselves that we learn to kind of conceal or to manipulate in order to conform to those public expectations. And so the very moment that anyone, steps out of line from that, and then another can say, well, that's too personal, or that's something that should be private, that's something intimate. It just upholds those dominant kind of ways of looking at the world and being in the world. And so it's just sort of I guess it's an unavoidable conflict that a lot of people have to figure out a way to manage. And the only way out of it is to be willing to be a challenger to that expectation. And that itself gets back to that vulnerability, that it is always this vulnerability that is simultaneously a part of what makes society oppressive, is shaped by oppressive practices, but it is also like it's the superpower. It's the only thing that can then create a transformation for both individuals and for society. And there's not really there's just like there's no separation between sort of the personal and political. There's no separation between kind of what might be important for an individual and then might be their interest, quote unquote, or their something that benefits them versus what's actually also kind of potentially empowering for the community at large and a part of, being able to make connections with each other that are authentic and real and even and loving, in to kind of get into some work you're doing recently on love and queer theory as well.
Yeah. I mean, what you were talking about at first, the way that the outsider positionality is both a source of violence and oppression, right? It's a way of silencing, oppressing, marginalized people. It is also like a place from which one can view the truth of things. And that's something that, I look at people like Anna Julia Cooper and Virginia Woolf, and you could think of theorists like the Combahee River Collective, right? Like seeing that there's this clarity of vision that comes from this position of outsiderness. And something that I wrestle with is the way that societies often rely, probably unknowingly for most people, but rely on the most marginalized to push them, towards something better, precisely for this reason. And it's a burden, right? And at the same time, like Audre Lorde, says, other people, they're not going to move unless you make them, right? I mean, Martin Luther King says that. A lot of people say that. And so it's a burden, right? But it's also, I've come to think more and more as I get older, the truth that people with power don't move unless they're pushed to. And I was going to say about public-private. Yeah, I mean, I learned a lot from Michael Warner early in grad school about how the public-private distinction is not pre-political. It's something that's produced politically, what gets to be seen in public and what doesn't. And it's, not too long ago that women weren't supposed to be seen in public at all, right? It wasn't great for them to be out in public unaccompanied, or there's that whole history of the public bathroom, like women not being able to use bathrooms in public. But anyway, so it's something that we produce in politics, like what's supposed to be in and what's supposed to be out. And I don't know, the older I get, the more I work on, the Chelsea Manning book, and then the book I finished on is called Rachel Carson and the Power of Queer Love, and it's going to come out with Stanford this winter, which is exciting. And in both of those books, I'm not sure what I think anymore about the public-private distinction in general. Like in the Manning book, I think I argued that what Manning was doing, and I think this is true, was trying to transform it, right? To show herself as a proper public speaker of truth, right? As this trans woman, and to kind of shift what's in and what's out. And I don't know, but I just don't know how productive it is in general. It's like a way of orienting ourselves politically. Like, why do we need it except to say that certain things can't be in public? Like I understand we don't want the police to come in and search our homes, right? Like, but the right to privacy as the way to define our freedom, I've never loved that. And I do think it also is not a productive way to think about environmental politics because we tend to think of things like energy and energy consumption and production as like private things or like things, that are involve corporations and we produce that in modernity, right? By saying that extraction, right, is something done privately, right, by individuals. So it's so often a depoliticizing tactic and a way to frame things that are commonly and publicly produced as not public and common that I don't know anymore if I think it's even very valuable.
Yeah. No, I think this is the thing that I've been struggling with too, because I am, I orient myself around, I guess, the way that we use privacy typically, like, I guess I am interested in sort of critiques of surveillance, both public and private. And so there's, it becomes kind of the opposite that you then define surveillance against. But I agree that there is, though, I think even individualist and liberal defenses of privacy that I am drawn to. George Kateb is somebody who influenced my thinking on this, and that he puts it in these terms that I forget the exact wording, but I think the other thing is that we often imply that privacy is about sort of a solitary individual. And maybe that's to some degree things like we were talking about with Socrates, and other kind of figures who are sort of these individuals against society, when in reality, we value it because of the way it enables us to have the discretion of our own connections with each other. It's actually more about kind of the relationships that we are able to form with each other that you can't really do in conditions of, let's say, total surveillance. And it is this sort of inherently relational and networked concept rather than a purely kind of separated individualist value.
Yeah, I think that's a really nice point. I don't know, in terms of like the law in this country, it's hard to think about how you could get away like without totally redrafting everything, like starting again. It's hard to think about how get away from thinking in terms of privacy, but it's kind of symptomatic of how we don't really know how to think democratically in this country. Like we don't really know how to think about our lives in terms of like flourishing, like what we do, what we want, like as a people, like how do we want to be? We tend to think very much in terms of like, how do we avoid constraints? And it doesn't open the door to thinking about, but wait, what do we actually want? I mean, I think it's part of capitalism. I think it's part of consumerism, which urges us to think primarily as consumers and urges us, to seek to be free to consume, right? Free from constraints so that we can buy and create a space for ourselves. But we're not really encouraged to think about like, what kind of lives do we want? So I think that often, like you're saying, like thinking of like surveillance as something we don't want because we want to like have privacy is kind of like a cop out from thinking about, but wait, why? Like, what do I want to do? You know what I mean? What should my life be like? Like, what does it mean to live a good life? What do we want as a people? Like, how do we want to live? And those questions are easily avoided by the recourse to privacy, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point. And so if you don't mind me asking more about this current work you're doing, because it seems from what I've read, you are thinking about kind of alternative like ways of thinking about love as political, and thinking about like environmental are the sort of, instead of basically again in another kind of contrast, like not defending the environment just because of the need for survival, and but also thinking in terms of pleasure and desire, and what our relationships with each other as human beings, but also with other creatures as a part of the world together.
Yeah. So this book actually emerged in conjunction with out of the Chelsea Manning book because I started looking at Rachel Carson because I was like, oh, gender and truth telling. I should take a look at her. And then went in a really different direction So, Rachel Carson, for those who don't know, and most people don't because nobody talks about it, was in a love relationship with this woman, Dorothy Freeman, from 1953 until she died in 1964. And what I'm interested in is that, Carson's Silent Spring was a major spark for the formation of the EPA, modern environmentalism, et cetera. And I'm interested in looking at her and her relationship. Dorothy Freeman is offering a different lineage for what contemporary environmental politics might be. And when I think about like the politics of climate change right now, what politics there is around climate change, we tend to see either like a politics of despair, there's a big politics of despair or appeals to fear. And then on the other hand, a kind of like, or denial, right? Obviously there's denial. I'm going to set that aside for a moment. There's a politics of fear. And then there's, sometimes like a techno optimism that says like, oh, we can just keep living this way and we can just carbon capture and I think that like Carson and Freeman offer a really different, their life, their experiences together offer a really different way in to thinking about climate change. And so I see them as experiencing what I call queer love. And in contrast to like a heteronormative love where you're, fulfilling this societal vision of what you're supposed to want. And you see your life kind of lining up with these markers that say you're happy. Carson and Freeman's love kind of upended their understanding of what a good life was, pointed them in a different direction and revealed the world anew. And they experience their love as a form of wonder, what Carson calls wonder, this feeling that they also feel towards nature, which is this feeling of like, this thing is so beautiful, but I don't really understand why it's beautiful, but that's part of its beauty. And so part of what I'm interested in is I argue that Carson's experiences with Freeman and in nature with Freeman are a big motivator for writing Silent Spring. And that what she was interested in writing Silent Spring wasn't like, let's get humans out of nature, right? But instead, like, how can we live with non-human nature in such a way that experiences like queer love, meaning, pleasure are possible? And so I see queer love as orienting us away from like fear-based living, away from focused on like, how do I fulfill this social narrative of happiness, which so many of us are. I certainly have been in my life, certainly. And instead, like, wait, what do I want? Like, what is meaning? What is important anyway? I talk about queer love as something that like you see kind of very brightly in their life together. But I think it's, really possible for everybody. And that once you start paying attention to it, you can see those sparks of queerness in your own life that are leading you to see, wait, maybe I don't really want exactly what, my capitalist society tells me I want. Maybe I care more about meaning and pleasure and love. And if you start caring more about meaning and pleasure and love and the non-human world that makes that possible, then maybe we can start to like see a way of pleasurable living that's not capitalism and be interested in creating that world. And so that's kind of the very rough sketch of that book.
No, and I'm really drawn to the idea if we do a contrast between, I mean, my understanding too is this contrast between like traditional kind of milestones and what people are told to acquire to kind of achieve, and that's kind of how we become fulfilled, and how that kind of also it can set up disappointment, I think, because people have certain expectations of how they will become, they will finally be satisfied once they have done X thing. I mean, you could even speak of this in terms of, the way that academic life is set up. You spend your grad school years thinking, I'll feel better when coursework is over, or I'll feel better once I've defended my dissertation proposal, or I'll be able to like live my life more fully once I defend my dissertation and graduate. But we're kind of always kind of we rack up the milestones and achievements, and then we still feel insecure, we feel like we're not enough, or we feel unsatisfied, or we've kind of, starved ourselves figuratively, or starved our relationships with others. And I think what is so helpful to kind of contrast that against is kind of it's the idea of, I guess what I'm trying to say is, some people I think get worried or they get afraid to kind of go against convention or go against expectation because they don't have a clear picture in their mind of what the alternative is. I think as much as we might feel, even a person who feels limited by certain social norms and expectations might still be afraid to, embrace other parts of themselves just because they don't really have a clear vision in their head. And we are so afraid of the unknown. Like the fear of the unknown might be more powerful than really anything else. And so it is only kind of like, again, the practices of the people that you've studied, these people who are outsiders, who have that positionality, who have taken it upon themselves to embrace their vulnerability, even while also using like anonymity as like an active practice of public acting in public without necessarily total kind of exposure, or using these different survival tactics that are actually also then creating these more transformative potentials, these visions of the world as it could be, visions of happiness and pleasure and relationships as it could be. And so we're always kind of relying on each other in those ways. And, you know, it's kind of being willing to jump into the unknown that then that makes it possible for someone else to, start exploring that to some degree.
Yeah, absolutely. Like I think that, political theory, we do analysis, we do we're critical thinkers, lots of people do critical theory. I think it's also a visionary practice. You know what I mean? Like thinking through, based on what we have seen, like where can we find other models or visions of what life can be? Like I think that in this political moment where capitalism is, I think, dying, a very violent, it will be a violent, long death, but a death. And in this moment, like we can let a vacuum happen or we can offer other visions. And I think that queerness, queer love is one such vision. And it's one such place of creating these connections. Freeman and Carson created a world. You know what I mean? They created a world of pleasure and meaning together. It wasn't just them. There were other people, who came in and out of it. And it was importantly built with non-human nature, right? This is, it's their love, I say, would not have been possible without it. Like it was what allowed them to find like the language and allowed them to have their experience of their love as something beautiful and not at the time in the early 50s, like disgusting or terrible or, and so I think that the vision, both the vision of what their life was and how that led Carson, I think, into politics, being willing to risk her reputation in writing this book on behalf of this beautiful thing she experienced and wanted to experience more and have other people experience. I think that that's important for us because it's very scary to think about taking down capitalism. You know what I mean? Like to dismantle the way we do energy right now. It's very scary for people to think about, like, because we don't have other visions of what a happy life looks like. Even though, as you say, we're often, most of us, pretty unhappy with this way of living and pretty disappointed. And at the same time, we don't really know anything different. And the other thing that I want to emphasize is that I think experiences like queer love reveal that the problem, like the reason why you're not having a super happy life, like maybe part of it is like just random stuff that's happening, but it's not you. You know what I mean? Like we're told so often, if we don't rack up the achievements, like academia is a great example, right? You didn't get that tenure track job, it must be you. Like, no, it's the it's higher ed is in a neoliberal crisis. You know what I mean? And I think that these experiences that show the paucity of our existing visions of what a happy life are, I think that queer love shows like it's not you, it's the world. Like it's the social structure. Like it's not, that's what Carson saw. The way we're doing pesticide and insecticide regulation, is not actually helping us lead good lives. It's going in the opposite direction.
No, that's great. And I actually, if you don't mind giving us a little preview, because it really struck me. You talked about how their relationship, Rachel Carson and Dorothy Freeman's relationship, kind of helped move her toward a more political direction when she was writing Silent Spring. Would you mind giving like a little example of how we kind of connect that their relationship and sort of her change in her approach from her first book and the Silent Spring?
Yeah, she wrote 3 books before Silent Spring, and 2 of them, The Sea Around Us and The Edge of the Sea, were bestsellers. The Sea Around Us came out right after World War II, and that was what kind of rocketed her to stardom. And in those books, she was kind of like a nature writer. You know what I mean? She was writing about the sea, she was a scientist, but she was a writer, and she was able to write about the science in a way that conveyed the beauty of what it showed to the public. And so people were really into those books. And she met Dorothy Freeman and Dorothy's husband, Stan Freeman, when she bought a piece of land on Southport Island in Maine after The Sea Around Us became this big bestseller. And suddenly she had money. She did not grow up with money. She was poor. And so she bought this piece of land and started to build a house and met the Freemans. And she finished The Edge of the Sea the next year and a half, while she was in this new, like, extremely all-consuming relationship with Dorothy Freeman. They wrote letters all the time, like many weekly letters back and forth when they weren't in Southport together in the summers. And what I see happen first is that she moves toward thinking about acting in public at all. So if the first step is like she starts thinking about conservation, which was a fairly typical way for people interested in nature, to be active politically. But she started thinking about how she could preserve, she and Dorothy started together thinking about how they could preserve this piece of land near, like in between their houses on Southport, that was at that time undeveloped. And that's kind of a long story, but it was ultimately unsuccessful. And it was after that that she moved toward writing Silent Spring. So what I see her as doing is, first, she starts to realize that, like, this thing is really important and beautiful, and like actually starts to feel like she could do something. Like she experiences this empowerment by virtue of her relationship, that like they both know it's valuable. You know what I mean? They both know it's beautiful. And that connection and that relationship allows her to see it as important politically. And she starts acting politically. And then after the failure to conserve this land, she starts writing, she starts doing the research for Silent Spring. And she's heard things about like insecticides, and then she gets really invested in it. And I think that her capacity for courage, right, to risk, because she had this reputation and she laid it on the line for this. You know what I mean? Like that was why this was a big book, was because she had this literary reputation and she was willing to risk it. And so it was, what I see is happening is, I mean, to me, it's like a marked shift. And I'm shocked, honestly, that nobody's written about it before, but also not, because they think queerness is like private and shouldn't be important. But I think that this experience showed her that like the normal social markers aren't it, you know what I mean? And that like we need these spaces to be able to have like love and pleasure and meaning, gave her this courage to pursue this project to try to like save, or do her part to save, the non-human natural world and the human world from insecticides and pesticides, which were almost completely unregulated at the time.
Yeah, yeah. I was really struck by how much I think that's a really fascinating. I see the connections there, and what the story you're telling about her work and how she, it's that empowerment to do something that then doesn't work out, and then it changes her thinking, like it changes her writing and her and it's supported by a personal relationship, by intimacy and connection. And what actually reminds me of is what you were talking about earlier. And I definitely see the connections to your earlier work, because it does remind me of the tendency to kind of expect from our political heroes this self-sacrifice or objectivity, this sort of separation from the personal. And it's like, who, when in reality, often in order, to get anything done politically, it's people who have a stake in something that are the ones who are making action happen. And that, again, can be beneficial for everyone. It's not necessarily just a personal interest, but I think we have a hard time, I think, with narratives. And it's interesting, where you see people apply that, oh, this person's, being selfless and heroic versus this person is, personally interested. And that's why, we should be wary of them. They're just trying to kind of get something from the state or something like that.
Yeah. No, and I think Carson was definitely acting on behalf of her own love, for sure. You know what I mean? Her own pleasure, her own love. And I don't think she saw that as disconnected from, the possibility of pleasure and meaning for everyone, but she was invested for sure. And I think that we would do all of ourselves a favor if we didn't immediately assume that because somebody's personally interested in something that their politics is less worthwhile, and instead ask, well, wait, what are they interested in? You know
Yeah.
what I mean? Like, judge it
Exactly.
a little more substantively instead of just assuming that the public private distinction is this shortcut to knowing whether it's right or wrong or good or bad.
Yeah, that's a really good way to put it. And yeah, we are recording on Earth Day, so I think thinking about in these environmental terms is so, so important today, just as much as it was for Rachel Carson and at that time. I was wondering, and it's okay if you don't. I just was wondering if you have thoughts on that sort of tension between the so often when we talk about digital technology, a lot of times, you mentioned the techno optimism. Some people think we can kind of like use technology to combat climate change, and that's the main way to go. But then I think also the thing that I'm concerned with is sometimes people not realizing how much technology is actually how much power it takes up. Like,
Yeah.
and energy.
Yes. Yeah.
So I was wondering if you had any kind of thoughts on that, and kind of also how the turn toward the environmental might kind of reorient ourselves around the way that we think about technology.
Yeah, I agree that I'm not sure people understand like the degree to which we need energy to run technology. Like when people say, yeah, go paper free, it's like way better. And I'm like, always? Is it? And I think in terms of like the techno optimism, one thing I would say is that the idea that we can just fix it through carbon capture or through like, you know, even like lithium batteries, which rely on, as Thea Francos is showing, and will show more on extractive practices that are, most often unjust. I think that when we look to those kinds of solutions, we're framing the climate crisis in a pretty white, Western, upper middle class way. You know what I mean? To say like that what the climate crisis is about keeping enough energy to keep our current way of life going. And for a lot of people, the climate crisis is about their life becoming, unlivable. And so I think that like we need to look at responses to the climate crisis that don't just keep, obviously, that don't just keep unjust capitalist inequalities in place, because that might resolve, carbon capture might resolve climate change for like me in my life. You know what I mean? Like, oh, in my personal life, oh, now I can just keep consuming the way I've always been consuming. But the climate crisis is about people not, being able to live in their home, losing the islands on which they live. It's just like such a broad, vast thing. And we need to start thinking about the climate crisis as that inequality. And that technology, when, like you're saying, is put into perspective, like from the perspective of climate change, at least personally, I think it doesn't look like much of a solution on its own. Like it might end up being a tool of ways to address it, obviously, but it's not the solution unless we're just talking about like the upper 2% of people in the world.
Well, and like you were saying with the extractive practices, something that people also talk increasingly about with AI is, as much as there's been huge developments computationally or in terms of the programs, there's also ways in which a lot of the training can often rely on labor around the world. And so, and the lithium production as well. Kind of getting back to your point about the inequality is, so I think the other response might be for people who are more optimistic about technology or less critical, and they might say, well, there's a lot of people around the world who want more economic development, who want to be able to access the kind of prosperity that we have in the US. And so who are we? And I think that's fair to say, you don't necessarily want people to be still suffering famine and other kind of severe poverty issues around the world, while at the same time acknowledging that there might be ways in which, prosperity in one place might be contingent on and is actually perpetuating the poverty of another place to some degree. And so figuring out, as long as we all agree, we all have this concern for the environment, figuring out solutions that can combat rather than exacerbate that inequality would be part of it. And it does seem like the technology question, it doesn't necessarily get at that inherently political question.
Yeah. And I think that just, I mean, I think it's unavoidable that like the way we live in the West will have to change in some way, and even if it's just like way less consumption and more than that, I'm sure. But I think that it's worthwhile. I mean, this is the whole argument of my book, to just start thinking about like start imagining, looking at other models of like what a good life is, and stop. I think that the other thing that turning to technology does is it's also like a way out again from thinking about that question. You know what I mean? By saying, let's just keep living how we're living and just like use other technologies to do it. And again, not that technology doesn't do great things in many ways, right? But that it's not a solution. And if we start thinking about what we actually want, and if we start looking at like, if we start allowing ourselves to be exposed to ways of living, to experiences, to desires that aren't kind of provided for us by our social system, I think we might be better able to start answering that question. And honestly, I think that part of the motivation behind all the book banning that we're seeing, banning of critical race theory, all of this ridiculousness that's terrible for our students, I think a lot of it, maybe not consciously, but it's a way of thwarting that question, a way of blocking people from saying, what do I actually want? You know what I mean? Being able to understand what possibilities there are for living, what our way of life entails, you know what I mean? The inequalities it produces. And I'm very riled up about all that, as I'm sure most people in higher education are. And yeah, I want more ways into that question of, what do I want? What is my desire? Who am I?
Oh, I agree. And I hope I haven't said this on the podcast before. Like, I feel like this is like I feel like, I remember, I think it's at the end of the Republic. Don't worry, Socrates, we haven't forgotten about you. But I think at the end, Socrates is talking about like, I forget what exactly it is, but he's talking about sort of like almost like a mantra that one might chant to ourselves to kind of grapple with our world to some degree. And so my version of that is actually, especially when things like the book banning is happening, or when people get really kind of upset over, like, I'm not saying there aren't certain issues with what gets called cancel culture, but when people get really alarmed and sort of blame a lot of politics on like college students, let's say, I love this Judith Sklar quote where she's talking about certain liberals in the 19th century. And she's talking about sort of people who are hoping that kind of, once you have enough freedom of thought and speech, like everything will get sorted out and we'll kind of we'll figure out like everything out. And she writes, freedom does not screen off the political spirit, but liberates it to grow unchecked. And so I love this idea of, I think some people think that freedom this idea, what she was arguing against is this idea that freedom will allow us to like sort things out and we'll find a consensus and we won't have to deal with like constantly bickering with each other and in actuality, freedom allows us to create our world together and explore politics and modes of politics that are a part of just being who we are and being in a community. And that kind of gets back to what you're saying about the book banning and also the outsider truth telling is the idea of blurring those lines or subverting what someone might say. Well, that's a personal or a private thing. We shouldn't be talking about that in schools or something like that, while acknowledging no, like the fact that we're saying that is a product of politics, and when we are free and we are free together, we're going to have to deal with the fact that we might disagree, and we might, have to be open to different modes of living, and people who might be afraid of that might actually be the ones who ultimately benefit from it too. And so that's kind of the challenge, and something that we need for the environmental, for rethinking environmental politics too.
And at our universities right now, I know that many places are being constrained by state legislatures, et cetera. But for those of us who are not, the more we can allow our students to actually read and learn and protest as in ways that allow them to figure out what they want, who they are, the better. I'm distressed by all the silencing around us right now.
Yeah, definitely. Well, is there anything that we didn't get to talk about that you want to discuss more? Because, you know, I mean, we've ended on a very open note that I think is also about back to the theme of like knowing that, silence is something we have to kind of transcend, and we do that together, like through connecting with each other.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the lesson from Chelsea Manning, especially, is that telling the truth from that outsider position is hard, and that the more the more connections you're able to make, the more practices of connection we're able to create, I think the easier and more powerful it becomes. I think she felt pretty alone, you know what I mean? In the end, she did this thing, I think, in a way because she had been led to believe that you could just tell the truth and things would happen, and that's not how it works, obviously. And I think that the creating connections, that allow us to tell the truth and to feel more powerful and to be more powerful when we do so is really important. And I think Carson did that. I mean, she had a lot more cultural capital when she wrote Silent Spring, but she did not to begin. She grew up poor in rural Pennsylvania, and she figured out, especially with Freeman, to create this connection that allowed her to feel courageous and powerful and to create a powerful book for the world of love she wanted.
Yeah. No, I think that's very well said. And but just to build on too, because I was also really struck when I was reviewing your book that you also talked about Chelsea Manning talking about her experience in prison and how she learned how to write through her connections with other prisoners. And so, and to your point, I mean, a lot of like the book banning, the impact of state legislatures, like institutions shape like whether we can talk and who gets heard. And so, changing those institutions is a major part of then allowing for, the communication, enabling better communication of these different perspectives. But then also, even within, seeing people like her who have within a institutionally oppressive structure and system still finding ways to kind of develop that voice and speak is both like it is like a heroic she's a heroic example in that way, but that doesn't negate the fact that like it's how hard it was and how much it's not a totally individualist thing, that like she, like you were saying before, I mean, when people grappling with marginalization and vulnerability, it's through connecting with others that then one can realize, oh, like I have access to a truth. I'm not just crazy or hysterical or something like that.
Absolutely. Yeah. Chelsea Manning wrote these articles from prison for The Guardian. And like you said, kind of became empowered to write and learn in part through her connections with other prisoners. And, I've kind of fallen off of paying attention for the last couple of years, but before that I was. And yeah, the documentary came out about her. And I think she was building these connections. I think she didn't have, earlier on, or didn't have as much. She created some online. And then I think in prison and after, she was really creating kind of a queer community for herself that I think felt empowering for her, for sure. I mean, she wrote a book later about her own experiences. So yes, just to close it out, connection, creating, paying attention to the experiences of pleasure and meaning that don't fit in to what we're told is happiness. Like all of those things, I think, help to start to build a place where you can think about what you want your life to be. What is your truth? Where should you tell it? All of those questions.
Yeah. Well, that's really beautiful. Thank you so much for joining us, Lida. I really love talking to you. It's really great.
Yeah, same, Kristen. Thank you for having me.
Our conversation really ran the range of the history of political thought, from Plato's writings about Socrates and Aeschylus's work on Cassandra to the Black feminist thought of Audre Lorde and the efforts and writings of Chelsea Manning. So I'll start from the beginning. The way that Lida sets up her book was, I think, something important for us to talk about, to show why we can learn so much when we compare contemporary politics to the history of political thought. So Socrates and Cassandra can be seen as these kind of two dueling ideal types of truth tellers. And typically we think about truth telling or even whistleblowing in terms like Socrates as this heroic martyr who sacrificed his personal and private life, was willing to give up his life and be executed out of a public duty to tell the hard truths that society didn't want to hear. He chose the life of a philosopher. On the other hand, Cassandra can be seen as a person who was able to access truth only because of the vulnerability she felt, the way she was vulnerable to violence. That was a position, a capacity that she had no choice over, and yet she was doomed not to be listened to. And there's a few different things that we get out of this comparison, this contrast. First, Lida helped us think about how truth-telling isn't always something that restabilizes society, that puts us on this clear path or foundation. That's something that we see a lot today, the way that people tend to talk about disinformation, something we talked about in our last season, this idea that if we can fact-check our way toward social consensus. But instead, telling truths often can disrupt things that we take for granted, that are misconceptions, that are holding us back in some ways. And this isn't just a destructive power, but something that can be visionary, it can be creative. It may still be challenging, but it contains a promise. And the kind of truth-telling that somebody like Chelsea Manning exemplifies for Lida, and as we discussed in this conversation, is a truth-telling that helps us subvert and rethink the way that we separate out what is public and what is private. It's ultimately a matter of politics and social debate and norms and tradition that determine who gets to appear in public as a trustworthy, objective person. And therefore, there might be ways in which the dichotomy between the public and private may end up being counterproductive or limiting or holding us back in terms of properly grappling with some important aspects of our democracy. So just as an example, we should think about the fact that what we determine as appropriately public is often not just a social norm, but something that is institutionalized. So the example that we discussed was the institutional policy of don't ask, don't tell in the military. This policy forced Chelsea Manning and others to conceal who they were. This wasn't something that she wanted to do. It was something imposed on her. And Chelsea was able to connect this enforced secrecy about something that was determined to be intimate or personal with the government's secrecy around military operations. As Lida points out, Chelsea's vulnerability to the military secrecy around gender identity and sexuality wasn't always taken as something that made her uniquely capable of developing this insurgent truth-telling, but treated, even by well-intentioned people, as something that was inappropriately personal, that could be used to downplay the merit of her political actions. I really wanted to think a little bit more about this challenge to our framing of things in terms of public versus private. And how do we justify or argue for practices and institutions that enable privacy against problems like surveillance? Something we talked a little bit in this episode about was how limiting the kind of negative liberty aspect of privacy can be. that too often we might talk about it in terms of avoiding the burdens, the pains, the obstacles posed by surveillance. And as Lida put it, this can be a cop-out. It's not that this is invaluable or important to be thinking about, but instead that we might be avoiding this kind of bigger political question, which is, what do we want privacy for? What do we want different practices, values, and institutions in order to do? The hardest question, Lida says, is what kinds of lives do we want? What do we want to do together? What is our vision of democratic flourishing? And so when we criticize things that limit free speech and free association, such as state censorship, book bans, these are limiting the freedom that people have to develop challenges to the way we think about the world, to develop alternative visions, and to be able to connect with each other, to grapple with the kinds of vulnerability we experience by affirming each other. And it is often through the development of intimate and personal relationships and also personal experiences that give people the perspective and also the motivation, even the courage to be able to risk and take action to make changes that can benefit everyone. This is a story that Lida tells so well and compellingly about Rachel Carson in this conversation and her writings for the Los Angeles Review of Books, as well as her upcoming book. And this vision of Rachel Carson really helps us challenge the kind of ways that we reduce political heroes, political action to certain expectations around objectivity or selflessness. In light of recording this on Earth Day and Lida's excellent work on environmental theory and thinking about environmental politics, I wanted to end by recommending some resources that are from the Mercatus Center, especially at the Hayek program. So in our fellowships, we love to talk about the work of Elinor Ostrom, who, in addition to talking about ways that communities are able to self-govern together and how those include forms of monitoring and reciprocity that avoid excessive surveillance, Elinor Ostrom also talked about climate change and how to develop policies at multiple levels of governance that would counteract the problems of climate change. You can listen to my colleagues talk about this work via the Hayek Program podcast. Jordan Lofthouse did a 4-episode series recently from September 2023 to last March. And you can also especially listen to the episode he did with my colleague, Bobby Hirschberg, on environmental economics, on climate change, and polycentricity. Thank you so much for joining us this season. This is our final episode of our 2nd season, and it means so much to me that you've enjoyed the podcast, and I've loved every moment of making it here with my colleagues, especially our producer, Melody McDonald. I am so looking forward to continuing these conversations. Thanks again for listening. Till next time.